Buildings remember things people forget. Casinos remember in numbers. In the exact place a ball comes to rest, spin after spin, night after night, whether anyone is counting or not. Desmond Achebe had spent 26 years learning to count inside the Belmont Crown Casino, a mid-sized riverboat-style casino built in 1987 on a fixed foundation after the state changed its gaming laws. Its original main gaming floor is still in nightly operation beneath decades of newer additions built around it. He was 61 now, gaming equipment technician, responsible for the mechanical integrity of every wheel, shoe, and shuffle on floor. The invisible work of making sure a game of pure chance stayed exactly that. He had learned to trust the numbers from a man named Otto Vance, who had kept the casino's equipment for 24 years before him and who believed, without needing to argue the point, that a casino's entire reputation rested on a wheel that had no favorites, and somebody needed to keep proving it, table by table, night after night. Desmond started at Belmont Crown at 35, hired as Vance's assistant during a period when the casino was still establishing itself on its permanent foundation after years of operating as a riverboat. Vance was 60 then, meticulous and unhurried, a man who stayed 2 hours after closing every single night to run tests nobody had asked him to run. "A wheel is a promise," Vance told him during Desmond's first week. The two of them standing over the casino's signature roulette table in the empty, dim gaming hall after the last guest had gone home. Every player who sits down here is trusting that the ball doesn't care who they are, what they bet, or what number they're hoping for. That promise only holds if somebody keeps checking it. Not the manufacturer, not the state. Us. Every closing night, every table, for as long as we work here. Vance kept wheel balance logs, precise spin test results recorded for every table every closing night, using an unweighted test ball and a simple tally sheet, a level of nightly documentation the casino never specifically required beyond the state's own periodic audits. He did it because he believed the audits checked whether a wheel was legal. He checked whether it was honest, which he considered a different and more demanding standard. Desmond remembered the first closing night. He stayed late to watch Vance run the test. The gaming floor emptied of guests, the carpet still faintly humming with the day's noise. He'd asked, honestly tired after a long shift, why they needed to run 100 spins on a wheel that had passed its state inspection only months earlier. Vance had set the test ball down before answering, unhurried as always. "The state checks once or twice a year," he'd said. "That's a snapshot. I want the whole film. A wheel can drift for months between inspections and correct itself right before the auditor shows up, and nobody would ever know the difference unless somebody was watching every single night in between." When Vance retired, he left Desmond the logs, along with a piece of advice Desmond had carried for 26 years since. Don't ever let a wheel pass an audit and call it the same as trusting it. An audit tells you it's within the rules. Your own numbers tell you what it's actually doing. Belmont Crown's main gaming floor had been laid out in 1987 with the confident, permanent optimism of a business expecting decades of steady business. And it had gotten exactly that. The floor centerpiece, a handcrafted roulette wheel the casino had kept as its signature table since opening night, sat in the same position it always had, surrounded by newer additions built up around it over the decades, a modern poker room, a sportsbook lounge, a second gaming floor upstairs, all of it circling the original 1987 table, like rings around a tree. Desmond knew the gaming floor the way he knew his own hands. He knew which slot machine bank ran warm during the Friday night rush, and which card shoe needed its motor service before a tournament weekend. He knew the particular hush of the floor in the hour after closing, when the carpet still held the day's noise and the tables sat quiet under dimmed lights. He knew the weight and balance of every wheel on the floor well enough to feel a problem before any test confirmed it. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that the signature wheels ball had always landed in the numbers 19 through 27, one specific quarter of the wheel, very slightly more often than pure chance should allow. IT wasn't dramatic. No player at the table, not even the most superstitious regular betting the same numbers every night, could have noticed anything wrong from the outside. One longtime cocktail waitress, who had worked the signature table for over a decade, once mentioned to Desmond that certain regulars swore the wheel like the 20s, a superstition traded quietly among players who bet those numbers more often simply because they believed the myth, never once suspecting there was a genuine, measurable reason underneath the folklore. The drift was small enough to stay comfortably within the Gaming Commission's own tolerance for equipment variance, the kind of statistical noise that existed in every wheel to some degree. But Vance had noticed it first, running his unweighted test ball through hundreds of spins after closing, watching the numbers cluster just slightly more often than they should in that one quarter of the wheel. Vance's earliest entry about it, dated 1996, read, Wheel 1 favoring 19 to 27 again on spin test. Bearing checked, level confirmed. Frets inspected under magnification. Nothing visibly different about that quarter. The wheel isn't out of balance. Something under the table is pulling it, watching it. Desmond had read that entry during his first window of the logs, sitting in the small equipment shop off the casino's back corridor, and it felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Vance had noticed something real. In his 11th year with the logs, Desmond began tracking the bias with actual statistical rigor, rather than simple tallies, running larger sample sizes, calculating the deviation from true randomness as a precise percentage rather than a rough impression. It took him nearly a decade of that rigorous tracking to see what Vance's simpler tallies could only suggest. The bias wasn't holding steady. It was strengthening, a small, measurable increase in the deviation each year, always comfortably within the Commission's tolerance threshold, unmistakable once laid out across 10 years of careful statistical figures. The wheel wasn't failing any test. It was simply drifting patiently and consistently, further from true randomness every single year. He sat with that realization one evening in the equipment shop, Vance's oldest log open beside his own decade of statistical tracking, the gaming floor dark and quiet beyond the shop door after closing. 2 men, 1 wheel. Nearly 30 years of the same patient question, neither of them ever quite ready to call it solved, and neither of them ever willing to stop testing it either. If the drift had been strengthening since Vance's first 1996 entry, something beneath that specific table had been quietly, patiently influencing the wheel for nearly 30 years. Hidden entirely from every official audit that only checked whether the wheel passed, never whether its passing margin was itself slowly narrowing. He thought about the cocktail waitress's story again. The regulars who bet the 20 for no reason beyond superstition, never knowing that somewhere beneath their feet, a wheel's smallest mechanical honesty had been quietly, measurably eroding for longer than most of them had been coming to casino at all. He wrote a new entry beneath Vance's oldest one, in the same plain hand. 10 years of statistical tracking confirmed the 19 to 27 bias is not stable. It is strengthening, slowly, consistently, still within commission tolerance every time, 'cause still unknown, continuing to test. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word available to him. Desmond had a theory in his 15th year, that the cause might simply be uneven where in the wheel's own bearing assembly, decades of continuous nightly spinning eventually introducing a subtle asymmetry that could explain a persistent deceleration bias without requiring anything beneath the table at all. He spent the better part of summer fully rebuilding the wheel's bearing and spindle assembly with precision replacement parts, calibrating the new components meticulously, confident he had finally found something a thorough mechanical overhaul could permanently correct. The bias persisted afterward, unchanged, continuing its slow strengthening exactly as his 10-year trend predicted. The new bearing assembly had made no measurable difference. Whatever was influencing the wheel wasn't happening inside the wheel's own mechanism. It was happening somewhere beneath the table, in the floor the whole assembly rested on. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the log, in the same unembellished style Vance had taught him without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Bearing assembly theory, ruled out. Full rebuild completed, bias unchanged and on trend. The cause is beneath the table, not in the wheel itself. Back to unexplained. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the bearing to be the answer. Mechanical, replaceable, a summer's labor and a closed question. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere in the original 1987 floor structure, beneath a table that had never once been moved in nearly 4 decades. The gaming floor renovation announcement arrived in his 20th year. Belmont Crown approved a comprehensive floor renovation, relocating and remounting every table on the floor, including the signature wheel, onto a new reinforced subfloor built directly over the original 1987 floor structure. The project treated every square foot of the existing floor as structurally uniform, without individually surveying what lay beneath each table's current position before construction began. Desmond read the project brief and felt an old unease sharpen into real urgency. The wheel would simply be relocated to wherever the new floor plan placed it, but nobody had any intention of investigating what had been quietly influencing it for nearly 30 years in its original spot, meaning whatever that influence was would remain entirely undiscovered, ready to affect anything installed in that same location going forward. He brought Vance's logs, along with his own decade of statistical tracking, to the Gaming Commission's equipment auditor. The auditor, a capable and straightforward man named Foster Calloway, ran the signature wheel through the standard certification protocol and confirmed it passed every official randomness threshold with room to spare. "This wheel is well within every tolerance we test for," Calloway said, reviewing the certification printout as small tables set up beside the gaming floor. A statistically minor drift like this, especially one that's always passed certification, isn't evidence of an equipment defect. Honestly, some degree of variance is completely normal in mechanical wheels. I don't have grounds to flag this as a compliance issue, and the renovation doesn't need to account for something that's never once failed a test. "I'm not saying it's failing," Desmond said. "I'm saying it's been drifting further from true randomness every single year for nearly 30 years, and nobody's ever asked why. Passing tolerance and staying constant aren't the same thing. This was never once gone backward toward more random, only further away from it." Calloway considered that, and to his credit, didn't dismiss it outright. "I don't have another explanation for a trend like that, but a wheel that passes certification every single time doesn't give me grounds to treat its physical position as a compliance concern. My job is confirming the equipment meets the standard. It does. Every time we test it, it was a reasonable position, and Desmond didn't have a structural or gaming equipment engineering credential to argue against it. What he had was nearly 30 years of a pattern that had outlasted a full bearing rebuild, and a growing conviction that a wheel passing every audit and a wheel actually unaffected by its surroundings were not necessarily the same thing. Desmond didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to a question he couldn't put down. What if Calloway was right, and 30 years of careful tracking amounted to nothing more than ordinary mechanical variance that would exist in any wheel spun enough times? A pattern he and Vance, between them, had slowly turned into a mystery through nothing but 2 careers of statistical vigilance stretched further than it needed to go. He had wanted, for years, for the strengthening bias to mean something real. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually mattering. He pulled Vance's 1996 log out one more evening and reread the entry under the equipment shop's single desk lamp. Something under the table is pulling it, watching it. Vance had never known the cause either. He had simply kept testing, closing night after closing night, trusting that the pattern was worth preserving even without an explanation attached. Desmond had inherited that trust without ever fully testing whether it could stand against a clean certification and a reasonable auditor's standard. He didn't have the cause confirmed, but not having it hadn't stopped Vance from writing the first entry in 1996. It wasn't a reason for Desmond to stop now. Not with the wheel about to be relocated and its original position left entirely unexamined, ready to influence whatever table came to occupy it next. He requested, at his own initiative, a single day with a structural specialist before the floor renovation subfloor construction reached the signature wheel's original position. Not to delay the renovation, he made clear only to understand what was actually beneath that specific spot before new construction sealed the question away permanently. The specialist was a woman named Priya Anand, who assessed older commercial buildings for hidden structural and mechanical features never carried forward onto current drawings. She reviewed Belmont Crown's original 1987 construction records alongside Desmond's decade of statistical data, and she brought ground-penetrating radar and a small borescope to examine the floor structure directly beneath the wheels table. What she found explained nearly 30 years of a bias that nobody had ever been able to name. "There's a large void directly beneath this table," Priya said, showing Desmond the radar scan at a folding table set up nearby. "A steel-lined vault, empty as far as I can tell. Based on the original construction records, this looks like it was built for an emergency fire suppression system that got redesigned before the casino ever opened. Whoever handled that redesign never updated the floor plans to remove the vault. Empty vaults don't spin a wheel, Desmond said. Not directly, Priya said, but an empty steel-lined space beneath a floor does something subtler. It resonates. The building's HVAC system cycles constantly, and that cycling produces vibration throughout the structure, vibration that mostly gets absorbed by solid floor everywhere else. Right here, over an empty vault, that vibration has somewhere to resonate instead of dissipating. It's an almost imperceptible effect, far too small to feel standing at the table. But a spinning wheel decelerating through its final rotations is exactly the kind of sensitive system where an imperceptible resonance could nudge the deceleration pattern just slightly, spin after spin, for 30 years. Priya's findings went to the renovation committee within the week. Foster Calloway reviewed her structural report personally and called Desmond afterward. "You were right to push for this," Calloway said. The wheel was never failing certification because nothing about it was ever technically wrong. It just had the misfortune of sitting over an empty resonating vault for 3 decades that nobody ever knew was there. If we'd simply relocated the wheel and installed a new table in that same spot without finding this, we have introduced the exact same influence into whatever game ended up there next, with nobody ever understanding why. The renovation plan was revised. The empty vault was properly identified, filled with engineered fill material to eliminate the resonant void, and the space finally documented on the casino's current structural drawings for the first time since 1987. The signature wheel was relocated as planned to its new position on a reinforced subfloor, and the old position, now solid, no longer hollow beneath, was noted permanently, so no future table would ever again sit atop an unexplained empty space. Belmont Crown filed a formal note in its facilities archive, crediting both Otto Vance's original 1996 observation and Desmond's 26 years of continued statistical tracking as the reason a hidden structural void had been found and properly addressed before it could quietly influence whatever game occupied that position next. Desmond kept Vance's logs. He added a final entry beneath the oldest one before moving the whole collection into the casino's permanent archive. Empty fire suppression vault beneath original, wheel 1 position identified and filled this year. Origin traced to a pre-opening 1987 redesign, documented informally through spin test bias since 1996. First month on record with a relocated wheel showing no directional bias in testing. Otto, you were right. Something under that table really was pulling it. Neither of us knew what for a very long time. He ran the nightly spin test on the wheel's new position himself, closing night after closing night, watching the numbers fall exactly the way true randomness predicted, no quarter favored over any other, for the first time in the casino's recorded history. Somewhere out on the floor, a new generation of regulars would eventually invent their own superstitions about this wheel too, in this new spot, never knowing there was finally nothing underneath to make any of it true. He thought about Vance, standing over the same table decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that a wheel was a promise, and that promise only held if somebody kept checking it every closing night for as long as they worked there. Desmond had carried that sentence through 26 years, through a ruled-out bearing theory, through a season of real doubt about whether 2 careers of nightly testing had amounted to anything more than vigilance carried past its usefulness. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep testing, the way Vance had taught him, until the wheel finally told him exactly what had been quietly pulling at it for nearly 30 years.